Hi, my name is Kathy Collins, and I work for Spectrum and New England Recovery Center. And today is our first live episode. I'll be co-hosting Airing Addiction in the Future Now with Lisa Blanchard. And we are very excited today to have our very first guest. So it's a pleasure to welcome Beck Gee-Cohen, who is up bright and early on the West Coast. And I consider him a leading specialist in the LGBTQ and additional community, and years of experience. So this first episode, both Lisa and I are going to ask some questions, and Lisa will sort of take a clinical angle on it, and my take on recovery. So we're really grateful to have you. And I guess first off, I'd like to just maybe have you do a little introduction of yourself and tell us as much as you feel comfortable with saying about your recovery and your job and what you do in this community.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I always like to be the first person on a big show. So it makes it, I'm going to just keep the bar wherever it is. So I don't have to reach for anything. So my name is Beck Gee-Cohen, and I'm the director of LGBTQ plus programming at Visions Adolescent Treatment Center here in Los Angeles, California. And I guess what I'll kind of talk about is how I got to this point. I think that's probably the best. I think I always like to ask the question, like how people get started in this field, or why would you want to do this work? And obviously, so for me, it's about my own recovery journey. And I'll be 15 years sober, 7/11/2005. It'll be 15 years. And I can't, I just can't even believe it some days. So, I think I got sober, in Bozeman, Montana. And when I got sober, I had a friend who was in recovery, and she had what I wanted. Like, she had like a sparkle in her eye, and there was something about her that I wanted, and I found out it was recovery. And it's easy as that, right? I mean, my life up until that point was a lot of stories, that we all have as people in recovery that, it's funny because now with this time under my belt, I think like, gosh, like how amazing my life has been from the time I got sober. And, prior to, like, I've always worked in the LGBT community, but it was at gay bars. and so now I'm doing the other side of work, right? And treatment. And, but the LGBT community specifically has always been close to my heart because I am a part of that community. And what I've seen over the years is just that, my community is dying from addiction. And, so I, in my recovery journey, I went back to school. It's just kind of like the old adage, right? I went to the dentist and I went back to school, right? I went to the two things I did when I got sober, and I started working in treatment probably about when I was about 3 years sober. I started as working with teens, taking them to like almost like a tech, taking them to they got minor in possession. So I would take them to volunteering, and I started to fall in love with like that work. And so I went back to college and I got a degree in counseling, and I got my master's degree in counseling. And over the years, it's kind of taken me all across the world, really teaching about best practices in working with LGBT clients. And I'll just kind of share this, at about 5 years sober is when I came out as trans, and that it was a part of me that I wasn't ready to come out as for many years prior to. I think a lot of that led to a lot of my using in isolation, and then mental health, depression, anxiety. And when I was 5 years sober, I was like, life is better, but it's not as good as it can be. And I was I went into a deep depression, and then I sought help. I sought help from a therapist, a trauma therapist, and who worked in the LGBT community. And now I'm here, almost, 10 years later. And I just feel so grateful to be doing the work that I'm doing today. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Whatever you want to share is always enough. So, hi everyone. This is Lisa Blanchard. So I'm co-hosting with Kathy, and I'm just so excited to have you as our first guest. And one of the things that you just said, I have to highlight because I loved it. Right when you said that you met someone that was in recovery, and that sparkle in her eye is what you wanted. And I just, I loved that frame of. There's so much diversity in the recovery community, right? And no one story is the same as someone else's, right? Everybody's journey is different. But everybody who achieves recovery, I think, has that sparkle, right? So I really just wanted to highlight that. I really loved that description, because I think that's awesome and so true of what I see of individuals in recovery, every day, and how possible it is. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for sharing your story. And so, of course, it's Pride Month, and this is so important it should be important to the world, but especially important to Spectrum and New England Recovery Center. And so that's why we have you here today. And we're all trying to grow and learn as a treatment community, right? And listen and educate ourselves. So kind of one of the things I wanted to ask you. Having run substance use treatment programs for over 20 years, and kind of now trying to make sure that we are welcoming to all, can you give any examples when you've either entered substance use treatment or have been in the recovery field where as a trans person and a person in recovery, you didn't feel welcomed?
What'd you start doing work in the field, when you were 5 years old, or what? You said 20 years. I think it's less about I think in recovery communities, and this is what I think recovery communities are so when I stepped into recovery, I was in Montana, and I'm from California, right? And so I moved to Montana. And people in Montana, the recovery community in Montana did not look like me, right? They did not cowboy hats, big buckles, my best friend out there is, a rodeo cowboy. And we're oil and water. If you walk, at the time, I had bleach blonde hair, I'm tattooed, and we were the odd couple, and we lived together, which is interesting. But I think that is really kind of what recovery encompasses, is all of these different personalities and different identities. And when you walk into a space of recovery, what you're doing is trying to save your life, right? You're all trying to save your life. And so and in my own personal recovery journey, I've always pretty much felt accepted in those spaces, in kind of a public sphere, right? Unfortunately, I think as a trans person walking in the world, it's more about the feeling of, what happens when I'm not accepted, when I walk into a treatment center, I'm always kind of looking around safety wise, right? Am I safe here? Am I being addressed on the phone in the correct way? Am I being asked the right questions? Am I on the paperwork, right? Is my identity on the paperwork when I first walk in the door? Do you see me, right? And I think that is the biggest kind of error, I guess, or the feeling unsafe or not feeling accepted, is that if I don't see myself in these spaces, then I'm going to automatically have my walls up and I'm not welcome here. And so that's really a lot of the work that I do outside of here, is kind of helping places kind of open their doors to that from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So.
And that starts really kind of at that front door, right? At that, initial screening when you're asking demographic questions, what does the lobby look like? Can you give some examples of when that's done well with the work you've used in organizations or you've experienced? Like, what are ways in which treatment providers can do that well and create that safe space for individuals in the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I mean, even goes further. I think even before the first phone call, right? It's like most people go to the internet, right, first. And so like sometimes, what does your website look like? What are they talking about around the LGBT community, if anything? And are they doing it right? Right. Because I've seen websites where they, it's like a cut and paste. It's like we're doing this work, and I'm a little hard, I'm a little hardcore around this piece because I think that it's also, LGBTQ affirming is the new trauma informed, right? It's like, it's this like, oh yeah, sure. Because it's a buzzword. Right. And so even with the buzzword, I have to look deeper at a program and kind of say, okay, cool. So you have it on your website, but you're still using words like transgendered, right? With an ED at the end, or so the language isn't even right. It's just like you've put it up because that's the thing to do. Right. And so, I think when we, as institutions, we kind of have to self-reflect about, who's at the table, right? We're talking, and I know you're going to be doing some conversations around race, which is really important. Obviously, always, it's like, who's at the table in the LGBT, and I'll keep it to LGBT, who's at the table in the LGBT community, right? Who's offering, do we just have one counselor in the back? Counselor Bob's gay. So of course we work with LGBT counselors, right? And it's like, great. I love gay Bob in the back, but we have to do more. We have to do a lot more around really assessing like what we're doing, how we're doing it, how it reflects, and even talking to our clients who are LGBT, like what was it, asking those right questions, maybe upon exit, right? What did we do? What did we not do right? Because we're seeing a lot of AMAs, right, go primarily in the LGBT community, specifically in the trans community. And when we look back of like, why did they leave? Most of that is being non-affirming, right? Whereas spaces where they couldn't share or be accepted for who they are.
Along those lines, I would ask the question, do you think it's important to assimilate into the community as the gender that you are identifying with versus, okay, for safety reasons, you're going to have a private room? Like, I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Oh yeah, no. So it used to be years ago, the bar was set at, trans people get their own room, and, we will put them in the, like, let's say I have a trans woman, we'll put them in the women's program, and then they'll have their own room. And what I know about addiction is that my addiction loves me to isolate, right? Yeah. And loves me to feel othered, right? I think it's really, what we want to do is obviously put that person wherever they identify with, if they're a woman, if they're a man, if they're a trans woman, trans man, like that is, if we're in a gender specific program, right? That's where they would go. Right. And also, I usually ask the person, right? If I have the availability of a single room, I'm, gonna, for their, not for this, like, not for the community, but for that person, like if they feel better about rooming. And sometimes they like, I've had clients before, like, sure, I'll have a single room, like that feels safer to me right now, just to kind of, get my bearings and see my surroundings. And then maybe I do want a roommate, and because that is like a big part of treatment is the roommate experience. It's almost like the college experience, right? That's where like a lot of the work is done, is after the clinicians go home, right? It's in the community. So we don't want to separate trans folks in their own rooms at all. And we just normalize the idea because they are, trans women are women, trans men are men. And so we normalize that in the community. But where that starts really is with staff. because we can't really, I think safety is subjective when we say this is a safe space, right? And it's like, well, for who, right? For who is it safe, right? And so I like to say, like, either we have safe moments, right? Or we, this is a brave space, and clients, we can't, we don't know who our clients are, or where they come from, or what they're going to be like, right? What we can do is know what our staff is like and how they're working with the clients, right? And how they're addressing any kind of, maybe some transphobia or, homophobia, things like that stuff, those things get stopped immediately in the milieu. So. But that's all dependent on staff, because at that point, as a client, you're just kind of walking around trying to get sober, right? You're just like, I have no idea what my life is like. And staff is modeling behavior, right? And so the moment a staff member lets something go or doesn't stand up for someone, right? Whether they think there's an LGBT person in the room or not, I just always assume there's someone who is LGBT. Maybe they're not out yet. And they're watching you as staff.
And I really loved what you said about isolation, because we've talked about this before, especially with the pandemic, right? Being so isolating for so many, is that addiction really thrives in isolation and recovery thrives in connection. And if we don't provide those opportunities for connection, because we think we're doing the right thing, right? We think we're being helpful. We think we're creating a safe space, but we're really not, right? We're creating kind of an unsafe space, even if it's well-meaning. And so I think you're absolutely right around the staff, and I think one of the things that I think comes up, and we've been talking to our staff for a long time about these issues, is they all think that they're working in recovery because they're accepting of all, right? They kind of have this idea that we treat everyone the same. And that's why we're such a great treatment program, and having to do a lot of education around, well, you can't actually treat everyone the same. And, and that's not actually true, right? And that's how we need to move from kind of this accepting to a true affirming, right? Not like affirming on paper, like you said. I mean, I really appreciated that. For sure. So what's the best way for clinicians and programs to educate their staff, on these kind of real differences that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's making a commitment to continued education. I've been to a lot of places and they say, I've done a 101 before, right? and I'm like, well, usually when I ask a place, when I'm either referring or, if I have a client that needs to go into treatment, and I'm really asking these hard questions, because the moment I say, do you work with LGBTQ clients, right? The initial answer is yes, right? To everywhere. Every place is working with those clients. And yes, because we are everywhere, right? And so it would be, and when I hear like a facility or treatment center that says, oh, we've never worked with trans clients, I'm like, you probably have, you just don't know, because they either didn't come out to you, or you didn't ask the right questions, or they didn't feel safe to have that dialogue with you, just statistically, right? And I think so making a commitment to training. Every onboarding should have a 101, I think, of an LGBT 101. And because most of the time clinicians are trained, or they go and get their CEUs because they have to, right? I think, I guess I was in Maryland, and they actually, part of their CEUs, they had to have LGBT as part of their CEUs for relicensure this last year. And so some of those some states are doing that now, but that's just the clinician, right? That's just the clinician that gets that information. The clinician is spending 1 to 4 hours a day with the clients. What about the other 20 hours a day? So usually I'll ask the question, well, when was your last training for LGBT? And if you can't tell me when it is, it's been too long, right? So there's so many different and also just like so many different voices, so many different ways of learning. And so like, if you can get those people in to teach those things, it's not always the same, right? We can have work in clinical work. We can have conversations around bullying for like techs, have your kitchen staff trained, because you don't want to, any misgendering that might happen or looks or anything, right? Like, as a person who's kind of walked in this space for a while, and as a trainer, I think I have a little bit of a thicker skin for when things are maybe happening around me. But if I have someone who's just coming in to treatment, who is already a raw nerve, right, that we have to do everything we can to kind of do our best around that piece. And we're not going to be perfect by any means, but we can strive to be. And I think that is really the affirming way.
It sort of triggered a question for me. You mentioned earlier that like on people's websites, there are things like transgendered, or and it makes me think of when terminology suddenly changed in the recovery community. We're not addicts, and we have substance use disorder, and I wonder, like, are the terminologies changing? And how do we keep up with that too? Is that just generally, that's just from a non-clinical person, like,
yeah,
I can barely keep up with it in the recovery community as a recovery person, but how can we not be offensive?
Right. I think, language evolves, right? I think that, like, for example, like when I started doing this work, 10 plus years ago, we were saying, what is your preferred pronoun? What is your preferred name? Right. And that has changed over the years, right? It's like, we don't use preferred because your name isn't preferred. It's who I am, right? My pronouns are not preferred. Like it's not a choice for you these are my pronouns, right? Like, and so it's almost like, or even, around just anything, like it's not my preferred sexuality. It's not my, it's like, this is who I am. These are like the foundations of who I am. So it's really important to know that language evolves, and, what we do if we are consistently training and upkeeping, and we have people that are kind of keeping an eye on that, it's like, oh, okay, well, this has changed. This has shifted, right? These are the languages that we don't use, right? We used to say, things like sex change. We don't say that. It's gender affirmation surgery, right? It's like, so, and those little things let me know, right? Even just in little languages, that you are a place that will affirm, my identity. If you can get language right, if you can, be on top of that, because that's the easiest thing to be on top of, then all the other stuff kind of can fall into place.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's also something you need to keep retraining, right? Staff turnover, they kind of forget that, you have to kind of keep it very present. And so one of the ways that providers will sometimes do that, and so I wanted to get your feedback on it, is, if providers wear name badges for like licensing and accreditation reasons, is that a helpful thing to have kind of the staff's pronouns kind of on there, as kind of a unspoken, we care about pronouns, and we, I don't know. What do you think about that as one of the ways to create a safe space?
Yeah, I think that's, I'm always pro that, right? Like, I'm always like, yeah, sorry, it's early. I'm like, what's the word? I'm always like for that. I'm always for like people putting pronouns in their signature, on their emails. If you have a place, if you have badges wearing your pronouns, and that also like leads to education, right? Like, I'm not just asking people's pronouns who maybe I don't know, right? If I visually see them and I go, I don't know if they're, are they a boy or a girl, or are they non-binary, or I'm only going to ask someone if I don't know. It's like, no, like if I just get into the habit of asking people their pronouns, no matter who you are, because the thing is with gender and gender identity is that it's not always visible to the outside, right? Like if I'm walking in my life and for safety reasons have to, dress a certain way or act a certain way or be a certain way for survival. When I come into treatment, maybe I am trans or maybe I am non-binary or and if somebody asks me like, what are my pronouns? I get it, I have, or, what my identity is or things like that. I think that there's a chance to really open up that door. But if we're not asking the questions, we may be missing the mark, and then they leave us, and the rate of relapse can be really high. So
you say that, I'm just curious, how would you ask that question? I mean, I've never asked that question.
Sure.
Would you just say, I mean, I wouldn't, do you prefer chocolate or vanilla? That is easy, but how would you like me to refer to you?
So no, so I'm like, no, but
it's practice.
It's a learning experience, right? So, what I like to do is start with myself, and like, to be honest, like, around to everyone, like to the, cashier at the corner store and say, hi, my name is Beck. I use he, him, his. What are your pronouns? Right. But in these spaces of like recovery and treatment or like, and groups, things like that, I think it's really good to kind of go around and say like, okay, what if I'm in a group setting, or if I have someone new coming in, I'm like, hey, and I introduce myself. Hey, my name is Beck. I use he, him, his pronouns. What's your name? What are your pronouns? And sometimes you have, and the practice is, and what most people don't want to do is do that with everyone. It's just like, because it's like, they're afraid of the look, right? They're afraid of like, why are you asking me my pronouns? Right. But that is the place where education starts, right? For our clients, and saying, so maybe, even on first phone call, you ask what their pronouns are, what their name is. And they'll be like, why are you asking pronouns? And you can say like, we have people of all gender identities here who use all different pronouns. So I just want to make sure I get, I want to be affirming of yours. And it's like, and then, you get you can either get you allow trans people there. Right. And you're like, yeah, they're, everyone is here, right? All gender identities are accepted here. And so and it's a small thing, right? Because for someone who is cisgender, who is not trans or is not part of the LGBT community, they can go seek treatment pretty much anywhere and be affirmed in their identity. But for LGBTQ people, as many treatment centers as we have around the world, the pickings are pretty small, that I would say are affirming places that people can really kind of get the help that they really need.
So we talked a little bit earlier about isolation. And so, that's a very big topic right now, obviously, with the pandemic. Having been working with the LGBTQ plus community, and those that may be in recovery, what has been the impact to the community, during this pandemic and isolation and challenges with connecting with others?
I can go off of my own experience. I think this is affecting people in so many, many ways. And I don't know about you, but we were talking before this, and you're like, kind of like, I'm a little bit more comfortable in this now, which is also scary as someone who loves to connect with people in person. And I'm like, am I going to be ready to connect in person again? Hopefully, right? A lot of LGBTQ people find communities online now. Especially younger people, right? That's like, and in rural spaces too, like there's almost been this like, this is how we're used to finding our community. Because if I'm one trans person in a whole like town in Kansas that there's no trans people, I'm going to find my community online. So there's that's kind of like, this is like old hat, like, right? I'm already isolated. And there's people like me who it's like, who has kind of been out in the world or seeks services to, the LGBT centers or groups or things like that. Luckily, right, a lot of this stuff has been placed online, right? there's a trans specific like 12-step meeting every single night that I could go to if I wanted to online from around the country, right? Where I've never been in spaces of recovery that are all trans people, right? And that has like, I think that for me, like that has like kind of boosted my, even my recovery. It's just like this, it's getting me through all of this, right? It's getting me through this like isolation and like not being connected, and I feel grateful around that. So for me, like that's how I'm trying to connect some people right now. Like, hey, there's support groups online that you can go to that maybe you wouldn't be able to go to normally, right? Especially in like Los Angeles traffic, right? I think it's hard to make it to meetings sometimes at a 5:00 meeting across town, right? It's never going to happen. So we've kind of created, right? And I think that's what people in recovery do, are so innovative in like, okay, well, this is happening to us, so let's figure it out and let's do this, and let's create this, and let's create smaller meetings and support groups. And LGBT people too are so, I mean, we've had to adapt and recreate and create our own spaces. So I think that is happening, and I mean, the isolation factor of this pandemic has just, has affected everyone in ways. And, and I'm saying this as a person in, I would say, long-term recovery, right? Where someone who's new in recovery, it can be really hard, right? But also it can be a little bit easier to kind of be online, and kind of have that, like, I'm in my home, like I'm a little safer than to walk into a room, like into like, and
I always think that's the hardest part in recovery. Like I'm in long-term recovery also. For me, it's easy. And I was highly impressed how quickly everything went to Zoom. Like, wow, if you asked us to create a new building, I think like we could put it up tomorrow. Like that's how I feel, how quickly everything happened. But I do think for newcomers, trying to find recovery is not the same as walking into a room. While it is very painful to walk, I remember walking into my first meeting. It was like awkward and painful. I didn't talk for a long time. And I think about the new people trying to log on to a meeting. And it's like, we all figured Zoom out on the fly. But what you just described is really even a better, like my opinion is it'll likely turn into Zoom meetings lasting longer. Like you'll have the trans community online meetings probably forever now. And I think any community that has become a subset, I think is going to maintain that because it's been so valuable that you couldn't get that, in all of the international flair that we have now. You could go to a meeting any minute of any day and your community is right there. Yeah.
I spoke to one of my best friends who's in Thailand, who, does and has had to do these meetings for a long time because she didn't have, she doesn't have like a real strong, like, recovery community there. And it's been awesome. It's been awesome and so, she invited me to speak at it. And, there are people from South America, there are people from, and you get to kind of this idea that this is a global, recovery is global. And so the feeling of isolation or alone, being alone in these thoughts, it's like, it kind of dissipates in that way on a global scale. Of course, like there's so much power in space of in-person space though, that is missing. But I think that we've, as people in recovery, we know what isolation is, right? We know what this, this is again, like old hat for us, like this kind of, alcoholism and drug addiction is a pandemic, right? That we don't talk about, right? This is something that kills hundreds of people a day, right? Even just, the opioid epidemic, right? And so we as a community are kind of used to this and we're ready for it. So this pandemic is nothing compared to what we're going through, what we've always been through, to be honest. Wow.
That's so true.
I was just going to say that brings me to a question on a personal note. not even recovery, but on a personal note, I do have a family member who is trans, who has sort of isolated himself from the entire family. That the family doesn't understand. I'm going into my own cocoon, and I want nothing to do with the rest of you, basically. And it's been very hurtful. And I guess I would ask the question, what could we all do to support the trans? Is there resources? Is there a book? Is there something you would turn the family to sort of say, we love you and we're here for you and we know everything we can know? I'm just curious if that, like, are there some direction you'd point people to that are family members?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you learn, right? So I can recommend books, and I'm glad to. I don't know if you'll put my information in this, and anyone can reach out to me, because I think it depends on the person. There's so many books for like children, adolescents, right, young adults, like, and so there's books, but also like you can. We have a plethora of information online, right? On like YouTube, like listening to trans voices. I think there's an amazing, if you're into like documentaries, there's an amazing documentary that just came out last week on Netflix called Disclosure. And it really is about how media has represented trans people and how that has affected the portrayal of trans people in media, and how that has affected the world, I think. And because, as it today, the amount of trans people and positive trans like role models in media is so different than it was even 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. And so media really drives how we accept people. And so I think it's a very powerful film, and to kind of to start there, it's really up to date. But there are plenty of like trainings, conversations, things going on around gender and families and how to, and because it is hard. And, I remember just on a personal note, when I came out to my family, I didn't tell them for a while, right? I didn't tell them for a while because I was so afraid of being rejected, right? Mm-hmm. And when I came out, in my family, because it is true. I mean, because we look at the statistics, right? I think about 52% of trans folks are not talking to their biological family, and or 46% of homeless youth are LGBTQ and have been kicked out because of that, right? So me saying, like, sharing my truth with you is makes me open to rejection, and maybe you won't love me. So I'd rather just like not talk about it. Right. I think that's just the trauma. Like, I just would rather not talk about it. But just like back to my family, like when my sister, said for her, the biggest hurt was that I left her out of this conversation. Like, I didn't say, I wasn't, so that she couldn't be there for me through this piece, right, of transition. And that was so hard for me because I just thought that she wouldn't love me, So we have all these conversations, right? It's like the unspoken, right? When we're not communicating, right, we're making up stories in our head. And that's, that's what I'm talking to my clients about all the time. Really. Yeah. Because if you're not sharing your story, people are making up their own stories about you.
1,000%. I agree. Yeah. It's the guesswork. Like, we're writing our own ending to it, and it's nothing to do with reality. Most likely. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. For sure.
Very good.
For sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And please reach out if you need resources. Yeah. Okay.
So anyone who's watching or listening at some point, we are going to include all the information so they can contact you. You're a plethora of resources, so we appreciate that too. So,
and one of the gifts, honestly, of this pandemic is it feels more normal to engage you on the other side of the country, right? So I see that as a bit of a gift, right? And so I'd love for us to continue to have conversations, because we are working on kind of our training plan, just like you described, at all levels with some frequency, and so I'd love to talk with you more about how, especially given these opportunities with virtual platforms, you could help support Spectrum and New England Recovery Center in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always glad to. Yeah, I've given a lot of trainings online. They're not as dynamic and exciting because I like to, do experiential work. But if it's, if any way I can use any platform or provide, other people to, give them, a platform to train, because I know a lot of different trainers and in this community that my voice, is going to be, one thing. It's not going to be different, but it just feels different, right? Like someone who's, I'm a white trans guy, right? Like I have my experience from this piece, and I think it's really important for facilities to also hire, obviously, people of color, women of color, trans women of color, to give their voice, because I think that is a piece of treatment. If I look at treatment as a whole, right, people who are getting treatment are primarily white people, and so and a lot of that has to do with who we have at the table again. So any way I can provide those names too, I'm always glad to.
Oh, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking, we asked a random group of questions here. Is there anything we didn't ask that you wow, I can't believe they didn't ask that? Everyone asked that.
Oh goodness. Everyone asks. Well, that's the best part, right? It's that's the whole point, right? You don't want to ask all the questions that everyone asks. I think we covered a lot of it. I talked a lot.
Thing on the table.
Yeah. I just can't push, training enough. I can't push the idea that, it's okay to be uncomfortable, that and also that, when you have LGBTQ people, and I know I've talked mostly obviously about trans folks, because I think that is, pressing mostly for recovery communities in that sense of how do we work with the trans community? But what we don't talk about is when we diversify our milieus, when we have people from all different spaces, it doesn't only we're not only helping that trans person. If we have trans folks in our communities, where it's not we're helping that trans person, we're actually helping the individuals who maybe have never had exposure to trans people. And ideally, it's treatment doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we don't. I think for me, when I work with my kids, I think that I don't want. Or I want my kids to be better people when they leave, right? And so by having diverse milieus and having kids from all over, different gender identities and sexual orientations and things like that, when a kid leaves, let's say they're a straight cisgender kid and they're in school and someone's being bullied, or someone says something about a trans person, and they can reflect back and say, you know what, my roommate was trans and he was super cool, or she was super cool, or they were super cool. And you can't do that. Right. And so I'm hoping that will also bring out a better world, right, of acceptance and affirmation. So just know that we're, and a lot of times facilities are scared about well, what is the milieu going to think? What is the milieu going to do? And it's why don't we try it out? Because sometimes we're pleasantly surprised about the acceptance level and how people are with someone who may be different from them coming into their space, right? So give them a little bit of autonomy too. So because we are on, we kind of talk about we're on a sinking ship of addiction, right? And so we're just trying to save our lives. And so it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are, let's do this together. Let's save our lives, because that's what this is really about.
I love that. I love the idea that kind of having that exposure and that affirming place, even for one person, impacts that milieu, which then can impact maybe the broader recovery community in that area and the community at large. I mean, I really love that that thought. So thank you.
Well, and when we're talking about gender and sexuality in treatment, which we should be, because there's a lot of shame around sex in general. Like, I mean, those are things that should be talked about. Is that when we open up that door to have that conversation, we actually find out more about all the others, you know? I mean, it wasn't until like, I think I was working with a group of men, all cisgender men in this group. And I had a gay male come in and talk about his sexuality and stuff. And it opened up the door for these other men to talk about their sexualities, or maybe they were bisexual, or maybe they had experiences with men, and those kinds of things were never talked about before, but it just opened up that door so that they could like reflect on it, process through it, take away any kind of shame, you know? And again, if you want to kind of help to open that stuff up before they leave treatment, because they're holding it, right? So when they leave, if they're holding on to stuff like that, that could be a potential relapse. Yeah.
Well, we're trying to be very mindful of your time here. We so appreciate it, but we do have one final question.
Okay.
So we ask all of our guests. You be the first. And you can pick whichever you'd like, but do you have a favorite book, podcast, or on a personal note or on a professional? But we'd love to get your personal take on, like, if you have a favorite book or...
Am I reading these days? That's the hard part. So I would say, lately, so there's a great website for trans men. I'll just kind of speak to trans men specifically. And it's called the Intentional Man Project. And there is a book that is written called Mindful Masculinity. And it actually could be for any individual who is working with men and kind of talking about like what, and this is a little bit self-helpy, but I think that, and there's like, they actually have a podcast too around like being transmasculine and redefining masculinity. Cause I think that as a trans man, like, I get to do that today. I get to redefine what masculinity is. I can, address toxic masculinity in my life and the world around it, and who I want to be in the world. And it's just been a really powerful through this pandemic. I've kind of done that internal work. That was the piece of that I wanted to do. So I've been going through that. So that's something that people can check out. Yeah. Anyone can check it out. I think it's a really amazing way to look at the world. So
thank you. Lisa, do you have closing statements for Beck?
Really just, this was really the best first episode I probably asked for. So you have set the bar high. I know you kind of started saying, well, I don't have a bar to reach for. Well, now everybody else does.
Thank you.
We so appreciate you getting up bright and early, on the other side of the country and joining us. And, I really think it's going to impact a lot of people positively. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hope you have a wonderful Pride Month.
Oh, thanks.
Enjoy your day.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.